Hello, welcome Stuart, Barry, Teresa, and Ronan. I heard that you are all online. I can't yet see you on the screen, but I heard you're all online. This is fantastic to have you here on board, in particular on this hour of the day. So I really owe you at least a coffee, if not a lavish dinner for your availability so early in the morning. Great to have you here. This shows, true commitment, and I greatly, greatly appreciate this. So now I can see you on the screen. Great seeing all of you. We're running 5 minutes behind schedule. We had an extremely good panel just before this session, and it took a little bit longer, but people are coming back to the room. And as you can see here, I'm joined by Dame Sarah Taunton, the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who is about to join the panel in a second. The two of us will be speaking from here, from this wonderful room in which we are, and colleagues, partners, donors, experts that have joined us here in person are coming back to the room, so we can start in 2 minutes. So just bear with us for another 2 minutes and then we are ready. Okay, thank you for taking your seats. This is the final session. The final session has 2 parts. The first part is again a panel discussion, and I just welcomed panelists joining us remotely, and just showing my appreciation for the fact that it is, I believe, 5:15 a.m. in North America. We have colleagues from Canada, from the U.S. joining us in these wee hours, and this is fantastic. We haven't expected that, and we're very impressed by you getting up for us so early in the morning. So without further ado, I think I explained at the beginning of the conference that we're very much looking forward to having a conversation with you on that is forward-looking, that shapes our program, helps us in prioritizing the work in the next 12, if not 24 months. So particularly looking forward to that. Dame Sarah Taunton is with me here on the panel. She will start her views. Then we have Stuart Davis and Barry McKillop. I refer to you as a duo because you are the incorporation of public-private partnership. Not the only ones, but spearheading and living public-private partnership. Stuart Davis, in his role at Scotiabank is a key partner of the FAST initiative from the beginning on, and Barry McKillop, Deputy Director of FINTRAC, which is the FINTRAC/CANAFE, which is the Canadian Financial Intelligence Unit. Then we will have Teresa Forbes. Teresa is a key supporter working in U.S. Treasury Department, formerly at the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit, FinCEN. Teresa has been, if I may say so, with us from the very early days, before we even had a name for FAST. And I do remember very well our first initial meeting at Grace Farms about 3.5 years ago. Christian is nodding, you were there also, where the idea of FAST was born. And we only gave the child then a name later. So Teresa, you can claim, like many others, parental responsibility and recognition for the FAST initiative. And then we'll have Ronan Cohen. Ronan I learned about Ronan's work and the work of Duality Technologies in the context of information sharing. So we spoke a lot already yesterday about private-public partnership and in particular about information sharing, but we should never forget that when you speak about information sharing, it's about information of individuals. And in the context of slavery and trafficking, these individuals are vulnerable populations. And by all means, their privacy must be protected when we speak about information sharing. And Ronan will present us a technological solution to how privacy of for example, vulnerable populations can be protected, and yet we can still share information, something, Henny, you have been speaking about too in your presentation. It's great to have somebody telling us actually what is possible. We're always good in referring to challenges, but increasingly we have to think about solutions. So that's a brief introduction into the panels, and now I have the privilege to ask Dame Sarah Thornton, the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, to start with her views. We already had you in the opening panel, and we continue to benefit from your presence here. Sarah, please.
Daniel, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And can I just take the opportunity to say thank you to you, to Christian, to everybody who has put this event together. It's been such a rich discussion, but I've also found it a very encouraging discussion, so thank you so much. In my opening remarks, I set out a few challenges. I've now been asked to speak about the future, and I thought I might make 5 observations. The first is that, have you heard the phrase that sunlight is the best disinfectant? Modern slavery and human trafficking are often hidden crimes. How do we bring this problem out of the shadows? How do we put it on the table of every boardroom? We know that the point where aggressive commercial practices, corporate negligence, and lapses in governance intersect with fragile communities, migrant labour, corruption and criminality is where the risk of exploitation is at its most acute and at its least visible. And while many people in business want to do the right thing, I do believe that, fear of legal repercussions, of reputational damage, of plunging share price, can lead to a kind of corporate paralysis, a hope that the problem will just go away. That's why the CCLA initiative, which somebody mentioned this morning, to find it, fix it, and prevent it, is really important. This acceptance that global supply chains will have forced labour risk. So my first observation would be, how can we encourage financial services to incentivise disclosure and remedy? The second point, which was discussed in that rich debate this morning, is about measurement. I believe that there needs to be a determined effort on international standards and measurement to guide those who invest and lend. And it seems to me it's about a lot of data, but actually what we haven't got is any agreed ways of measuring it. And what struck me with all the discussions about climate and carbon is, as I was thinking about this, the Paris Agreement could never have set a net zero target if there was no way to measure carbon. It seems to me that measurement is essential for progress. So can we envisage a website we might go to in the future to find a number for any of the social components of ESG? In the short term, maybe the approach will be qualitative, but in the long term, could there be a more quantitative approach? Talking to people who are engaged in the issues of climate, over 20 years ago, there was no sense of how to measure it quantitatively. It did take a long time. So what can FAST do? What can we all do to catalyse work on measurement? The third point I wanted to make, and it was great to hear Lucia this morning from the insurance business, because I have felt for the last year or so that insurance services can do an awful lot more to leverage the anti-slavery agenda, and we've been working on that. And some of it is about specific products like marine cargo clauses, or developing insurance around reputation, supply chains, director and officer insurance. But I do think there's a more strategic approach, which sees forced labour as a risk, and that insurers should be requiring companies to minimise that risk before they insure. Better to have a carrot than a stick. And in that way, I think insurance can encourage the positive rather than insure against the negative. I was recently talking to a London-based CEO of a major insurance company who suggested to me that when they're insuring a business, they're really insuring the leadership of a business, about where it stands on its purpose, on its culture, on its ethics. So I'm just wondering, as FAST thinks about new projects, whether insurance is an area, I know you've done some work on it, but is an area for more work, both at the tactical level on products, but also at the strategic level. The fourth observation is one that I mentioned on Monday, and it's something that was returned to time and time again, about the fact there is no competition with the E and S in ESG. And of course, let's not forget governance either. As we've seen and as we've heard, sometimes they are seen in competition. But over the last 2 days, I think that we have seen that is just not the case, and they often have common causes. Social issues, of course, cover a very wide range of issues, whether it's women on boards, diversity and inclusion, gender or ethnicity pay gaps, to mention but a few. And business leaders report being asked to account for more of their social performance from stakeholders. But interestingly, when I've had that conversation, very few are being asked about forced labour. And so that's one of the issues, I think, when we think about social, that issues of slavery and forced labour are just a part of that. And that's why I was interested to read, there was a report published by the International Regulatory Strategy Group, working with KPMG earlier in the year, called Accelerating the S in ESG. Now, the report calls for a global consensus on principles and minimum standards with appropriate granularity. It calls on the leadership of the financial services to apply those consistent standards across all jurisdictions. But significantly, it suggested that modern slavery becomes the lead social issue and the focal point for the development of social standards. And now, of course, I support the idea that modern slavery could be the lead issue in the development of social standards, because if a company is negligent in this area, I think it should be a warning that it's probably negligent in other areas of social issues. And in that way, it's a bit like the canary in the coal mine. It's the thing that kind of just says, actually, if this isn't being taken seriously, what else is not being taken seriously? And that's why just transition is rising to the top of the agenda as the connective issues that bind together climate goals and social outcomes. We know about the key ingredients, they're well established: social dialogue in the workplace, respect for labour standards and human rights, economy-wide skill development and retraining, buttressed by social protection and safety nets. It's a conversation Daniel and I have had. How can FAST work with this and work with environmental concerns as we push this agenda together? And Alex Thayer and I worked earlier in the year on trying to get real commitment from the G7 conference in June in Cornwall. And many of you will know that the leaders' commitment in paragraph 29 committed to the G7 that they were concerned about all forms of forced labour in global supply chains, including state-sponsored forced labour of vulnerable groups. We agree on the importance of upholding human rights and international labour standards, including those derived from the ILO membership through global supply chains and tackling instances of forced labour. And they therefore tasked their G7 trade ministers to identify areas for strength and cooperation and collective effort towards eradicating the use of all forms of forced labour in global supply chains. Is that an opportunity? How can we leverage that working together? And I know some of us in the room have been trying to leverage that commitment of the G7 leaders. And just in kind of summing up, one of the things that I've been playing with is this idea that, just had a great conversation actually with Christian from UBS, trying to argue that, the social issues, should be risks that are material in the way that climate is. And is that possible, not to see it as something that's a compliance, but actually can it really be seen as risk? And when I talk about this sense of, do we want to get on the right side of history? I reminded of the often misquoted Martin Luther King quotation when he talked about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Now, you've got to be careful when you quote that, but this sense in which regulation in terms of forced labour and modern slavery is only going in one direction across the globe. From modern slavery statements in the UK, Australia and California, to the EU's Green Deal and Non-Financial Reporting Directive to import bans in the US. And of course, Europe is consulting on its plan to introduce mandatory sustainability due diligence across whole value chains. Financial services can wait to be directed, or they can show leadership as they help to build the businesses of the future. I strongly believe there's more scope for leadership and voluntary activity. And over the last few days, I've heard real determination from many organisations to put this issue higher on their agenda. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for FAST to support and encourage this energy and momentum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I'm really looking forward to all our future common work that we're doing. We have already collaborated on some occasions, but I think this momentarily will mark actually a deepening of that relationship, and I'm very much looking forward to that. Moving on to, mentioned already, the duo, Stuart and Barry. I hope you don't mind me referring to as a duet. But it's really interesting to see what's happening in Canada in various regards, but in particular on public-private partnership. Like I think in the Netherlands, in Australia, in the UK, these probably been the first ones to think, not only think about public-private partnership, but make it happen. And in particular in the area of trafficking and slavery, Canada is showing results. And that's also important. It's not just to do explain what we do, but also to say what actually the impact is very concretely. So with that, Stuart, I may start with you. Great having you this early morning here, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for having me, and I apologize. I had a few technical difficulties this morning, but great to be with the panelists, and look forward to the conversation today. As we think about the FAST initiative, I'm going to approach this both from a top-down perspective and the work that we're doing, through the UN University and Liechtenstein initiative, but also approach it from the bottom-up perspective, the practical foots on the ground and what we're experiencing here in Canada as we roll it out, as well as we contemplate bringing it forward more globally. The FAST initiative, is a fruitful initiative by any means and by every means for financial institutions, banks to get involved in, but it also involves a much broader community set that of partnership with our federal regulators, as Barry will speak to in just a moment, but also with a variety of NGOs that's really made it successful. The reason that these partnerships are so critical is because banks by themselves are only a part of the equation, and we see a very small part. And through these partnerships, we bring together more a collective effort and community effort to tackle the challenges of trafficking, whether they be in the form of physical trafficking or digital trafficking of sexually explicit material. And labor trafficking as well is, extensively an emerging issue in the financial sector that's getting a lot of attention these days. But our partnership model, let me describe that here with Scotiabank and what we're doing. We've taken a very trauma-sensitive approach, and for that reason, we partner closely with NGOs to get pre-qualified referrals. It's not just an open door policy that anyone that claims to be a victim or a survivor of trafficking can walk in and open an account, but we genuinely prefer those that are working closely with NGOs that have indicated a willingness to recover their lives with the financial means being a part of an overall equation. So to that extent, we have distinct branches that are in close proximity to the primary locations of the NGOs that are helping survivors of human trafficking. And we look to provide checking, savings, and credit products, at least in our initial iteration. Currently, we're partnered with 4 different NGOs in 4 different provinces across Canada. We're looking continuously to expand that. We also offer our branches that are focused in these focused areas trauma-sensitive training, because there is a degree of an awareness that they need, both as to what these individuals have suffered, but also how to bring forward a deeper understanding of the financial services and products that are needed. What we don't do, and we've seen some other institutions adopt this, but we don't treat these customers any differently outside of that onboarding experience and ability to provide them a bit of customized financial services. We don't monitor these accounts any differently. We don't treat these accounts any differently than we do our existing accounts. And I think that's a very important consideration. We do approach opening these accounts a little bit differently, though. We've worked closely with FinTrack to establish unique measures for identification where traditional or customary identification may not exist, and we're looking to continue to expand that. I think that's an area that, as we consider the context and the go-forward approach for banks globally, it'd be good to have some of our international bodies make some recommendations on best approaches for identity verification for this category. The other thinking too is that as more and more banks get involved, the unique approaches that we've adopted in the earlier stages for referrals, there will be some strain perhaps on the system and the NGOs. I mean, it's in some ways there's only so much of a conduit that can work through the existing NGO referral process, and I would think we want to take consideration of how perhaps maybe working more closely with governments and the court systems and the other mechanisms that do exist both domestically and internationally to provide a more effective construct for referrals, as well as local law enforcement and police forces. One other thing I would suggest, and it's been our own practical experience, is although we saw an initial surge in referrals, it's quite challenging to maintain that momentum of referrals from NGOs. There's only so many survivors in the system at one time, but also there's many other considerations that are going on concurrently for individuals in this, as well as the NGOs and their administrative capacity to make effective referrals. And I think it's been discussed too that an important part of the recovery process is helping individuals regain their financial history, especially when credit has been disrupted. And so definitely I echo the comments of the previous sessions about deeper engagement with the credit bureaus and other vectors by which records can effectively be expunged or pardoned where the cases are appropriate. So here in Canada, we've had great success. We are now looking incredibly forward to partnering further for the joint project in the Caribbean and LATAM markets at which we serve, but also continuing to expand this to the Indigenous communities in Canada, which are a very vibrant and large community in Canada that suffers many of the same impacts as well. And to Sarah's prior comments, we have led a lot of discussion, at least within our own community, about this is truly an important part of the ESG considerations. And it bears a compelling case for all institutions to consider, not just banks, but all institutions. Yes?
We just lost you for 30 seconds. You're back again. We can hear you again.
All right, thank you.
We didn't have you for 30 seconds.
Did you hear my comments on the Indigenous communities?
Yeah, it started with that. So if you can finish that thought, that would be great.
Yes, thank you. We definitely look forward to expanding both with the Indigenous communities here in Canada, as well as partnering closely with the UN University as we consider expansion in LATAM and the Caribbean markets. And I would also echo Sarah's comments earlier that this is an incredibly important part of the ESG consideration, not just for banks, but for many other industry types, the hotel industry, the travel industry, and we are seeing a greater adoption of that. But as ESG statements become more predominant, and especially the S considerations, we think it's an important issue for the uptake across the corporations within the globe. And then finally, continued advocacy with our primary regulatory authorities around the importance of this a vector, not just of action through the FAST initiative and similar types of initiatives, but reporting In many jurisdictions, this is not a mandatory type of reporting to the FIUs. In fact, the dollar threshold associated with many of these crimes is quite low. And where banks and other financial institutions do detect this type of crime, it's usually up to their judgment to report it, because it's not always a predicate offense. And in some jurisdictions, it's not even classified as a crime. So, I think it's important that we consider from a global policy perspective, this space, as well as, again, the ID requirements that could be promulgated on a more multinational basis. So thank you, Daniel, for having me, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. I know you will have to attend board meetings later on, but if you can stay with us for another 15 minutes or so as a minimum, we will hear Barry's intervention, and then I'll open the floor for any questions. Great, Barry, you're next, please. Barry McKillop, the Deputy Director of the Canadian FIU.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning all. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning with you. Despite the hour, Daniel, it's always a pleasure to be able to talk about what we're doing in Canada, to talk about what we can do globally to eradicate human trafficking. I think, as Sarah mentioned, it really is a global call to action. And when we're looking at what we're doing in Canada, it's great to always be on these panels with Stuart, because he's covered the Survivor Inclusion Initiative fantastically, and it's stuff that I don't have to cover at this point. FinTrack is certainly proud of being involved in that and doing what we can. And I think Stuart really did touch on a couple of very important issues. One is our approach in Canada is really, it's from a regulator perspective to the regulatee, it's compliance for intelligence. So it's not just compliance for compliance sake. We don't want Stuart to check the boxes and say he's being compliant. We want compliance for intelligence. And we only can get there if we have a trusting relationship and a trust-based relationship with the banks and other reporting entities that we deal with. That takes time, it takes effort, and it takes people that really want to make a difference. And that's really what we need to see, and that's what we need globally. And I think that's what's missing in times globally, is that recognition that everybody has a role to play in this. Despite your role, whether it's a regulator, whether it's a bank, whether it's a reporting entity, whether it's law enforcement, we do have to work together. It's the only way that we're going to eradicate human trafficking. It's the only way we're going to make a dent into this. Sarah mentioned a lot of different areas where we see critical interventions required that we've worked on with respect to our public-private partnerships. It's evident just by the nature of this panel. The public-private partnerships are not just the regulator and the regulatee, it's others around. It's technology, it is the transportation industries, it is the NGOs, it is the hospitality industries that all need to work together towards this, that we all do have a role to play. And I obviously can't miss the opportunity, because I've seen firsthand how much stronger we are when we have a public-private partnership approach to an issue. So I certainly can't miss this opportunity to talk about Project Protect. It is our flagship project. It's our public-private partnership that we started and we kicked off in 2016 to combat human trafficking. And I must say that this really was a first of its kind. We had no model to follow. We had no blueprint to follow. I like to say it was really based on a few pals getting together. And while pals can be friends, for me, it stands for, it's people that have a passion to make a difference, the authority to make change happen, and the leadership character to carry through with an idea. And that's really what we had between Stuart and Peter and myself and Timia. That's what we had. We're a few pals that got together and said, we need to do something. There is a better way of using financial intelligence to combat human trafficking. We can figure this out. We can put this together. It did require work. People ask me around the globe how you do this. It very much is a lot of hands-on work initially. You have to look at your data set. You have to look at the data set that's in the FIU, that's in the banks, that's in the NGOs. Identify actionable indicators that are going to allow the banks to develop those algorithms and use the technology that Ronan's going to speak to identify those transactions. As Stuart said, they're very small dollar transactions. You're not looking at the large electronic fund transfers across boundaries. You're looking at small transactions, the patterns of which, if they're looked at properly and identified and flagged, they are indicators of human trafficking. We've seen since we've launched it, we've seen probably a 750 to 800% increase in STRs, suspicious transactions reported to FinTrack. I can tell you right now, our banks are the front lines of our AML regime. The work that Stewart's AML folks do, and other obviously AML folks in the banks and large MSBs, the work that they do on the STRs, both in quantity and quality, is really what allows us to provide the intelligence to law enforcement. Absent that, we have nothing. We need that partnership. We need those reports. We need to be able to provide Stewart with the indicators that are useful for his transaction monitoring. He has to be able to build this together. And the goal for us is really identifying those unknown unknowns. It's relatively easy to get a name from the police and provide the transactions related to that particular individual. It's another story to be able to provide the police with names of individuals who are committing human trafficking whom they did not know of. And our transactions, our disclosures that we make to law enforcement currently probably run about 80% proactive to police in Canada and internationally. These are disclosures that we make on people that are unknown to the police or have not yet been connected to human trafficking. And that is really critical because the earlier we can identify the perpetrators and the victims, the earlier we can have survivors and we can create survivors. And that's really what this is all about. We've done well over 1,000 disclosures to law enforcement, both domestically and internationally since 2016. I would say that's great work. I would say it's also unfortunate that we have that much human trafficking. But I think that if we continue doing this, we will make a difference. We will be able to make a difference in this crime. Our partnerships with our banks in particular have grown. We've launched 4 other projects, which are based on the same PPP model. The same type of actionable indicators, the same type of results that we're seeing when we talk about measurement. We measure our success is measured in not only the STRs we receive, but the disclosures that we can make to law enforcement, and then the arrests and hopefully prosecution as well, both of which are out of our hands when you look at Stewart and I, but we do provide the intelligence to law enforcement. And we have PPPs that look at romance scams, fentanyl trafficking, underground banking, and the impact it has on real estate and the ability to afford housing. And our most recent one focused on online child sexual exploitation material and how we can attack that. Again, as Stewart mentioned, these are small dollar amounts. So the indicators are critical in being able to identify this. And we have seen an impact here, a positive impact on the investigations and the work of law enforcement in these areas. And Project Protect continues to evolve as we look forward, not only with the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which Stewart has talked about, the role of the regulator in saying, yeah, there is a need to provide exemptions here. There's a need to provide different ways of onboarding clients and recognizing the needs both for survivors of human trafficking, but as Stewart mentioned, also in our Indigenous communities in Canada. But we're also looking at what other partnerships can we bring into the fold in ways that we can affect an even bigger impact. And in Canada, we're looking at partnering with Payments Canada, for example, which is our domestic payment rail system. How can we leverage existing infrastructure or infrastructure that's being modernized right now? How can we leverage that to increase the view, increase the eyes on the transactions that might be linked to human trafficking? All countries have a domestic rail system in terms of their payments. If we can get this going in Canada, if it works, it's something that we would love to push out globally. The impact, I think, would be fantastic if we had a global approach looking at using the infrastructure that already exists. So, as I said earlier, it is a global call to action, but we're only going to affect the change that we want if each of us take concrete domestic steps that are going to be able to create that pathway for our global journey that we can take together. So I really look forward to the conversation here. I look forward to anything. Daniel, as you know, you can call on me at any point in time. I'll go around the world, virtually or not, eventually, hopefully it'll be in person, to advance this cause, to move these things forward. I know it works. We've seen it work in Canada, and we know that it can work elsewhere, and we're looking forward to being able to play the role that we can play in helping to expand this and to show that, you know, if we have to demonstrate to regulators and to financial intelligence units, there is a role that we can play in concert with our partners, in concert with our public sector, private sector partners to make a difference in this area. So thank you very much. I look forward to any discussion, any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, both for you, Barry and Stuart. Two, I think, important issues going forward that you raised. One, Barry, on payment system. I think that's certainly an area we need to look at. We cannot only look at the banking sector isolated. And given the nature of the issue, which is very much linked to organized crime and transnational crime, that's an essential part of it. But also back on the Survivor Inclusion Initiative that Stuart spoke about. We had a session on the initiative yesterday, and I'm very happy to let you all know that both FinTrack and Scotiabank are partners in our plans to expand the Survivor Inclusion Initiative to Latin America. Given that you're on the same continent, there's certainly a keen interest behind that. So we're working also on that project with public and private sector participants and to team up, join forces. I will start with a question that I must ask you. I can't miss that opportunity having you both here with us. How do we generate more Barrys and Stuarts and what I mean is, you know, Barry, as a regulator, not only as an FIU, classic FIU, but also as a regulator, you seem to be committed. You know, this is a priority for your agency, but I think there are not too many other countries and regulators are joining you yet with that clear message. So the question would be what would we need to do to convince others to also see that as a priority? And I think the same question then to Stuart, more on the financial sector. What made Scotiabank do what you do, and what is the compelling argument for other financial sector participants to join these efforts? Barry, can I start with you on more the public side of things?
Certainly, I think to a certain extent it does come down to personalities. I think Stuart would agree. You do need to identify somebody that really does have a passion to make a difference. And, you know, as I said, authority to make that change happen. But I really do think, I mean, human trafficking is a crime that is motivated by greed, and it is a predicate crime to money laundering. We have an anti-money laundering regime. This is a predicate crime. There is a requirement, and there are international standards to report on crimes that are predicate crimes to money laundering. I think as a regulator, for me, and I think what I would tell other regulators is that the only way that you're going to be effective in an anti-money laundering regime is if the reporting entities and those that report to you are actually providing you with the intelligence that you need. And the only way they can do that is if you work together to identify what are the priorities, how can we report, how can we increase the reporting, and how can we make a dent on the money laundering regime in your particular country. Human trafficking in Canada has been also, it's a government priority as well. So when you look at, it's a priority across all of government as well as across our banking institutions. Stuart in particular, and the work that he's done both prior with BMO and now what he's doing with Scotiabank. These are just, you really do need to identify individuals to start. It's like any other good idea. You need somebody that can push that idea. You need somebody that wants to make that difference, that wants to make that change. But there are benefits, and there are benefits. Our public-private partnerships are bank-led. And the reason they're bank-led is not only because they're the front line of the regime, but also because of the social good and the reputational good that this brings to a bank. If I'm a young person or a business and I want to invest money, I want to invest it in the bank that has a social conscience. And I think that's critical. A bank that is concerned about the supply chain, as Sarah mentioned, a bank that is concerned about individuals, that takes a victim-centered approach to issues and social issues. I think that's key. And I think that it's a matter of, it's easy just to look in your lane and not look outside your lane and not do anything outside your lane. But I think the concept of being stronger together is easily demonstrated. We have the results, we can demonstrate that. And I think it's a matter of getting the right people in the room to talk and develop those relationships. And that's really where it starts, is to develop some of those trusting relationships and to build from there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry. Stuart.
Yeah, Barry's right. I mean, it begins with you know, a strong partnership and personal commitments. That's the passion that drives. And I don't think you know, that's unique to Canada. I think that can be found globally, but it does really require you know, a good connectivity between the regulatory authorities, at least in the banking sector, and the banks themselves and other peer banks to initiate the momentum. Barry used the acronym PALS. You know, I would suppose the S means sponsorship, right? We all need a strong degree of sponsorship. And I think having voices behind us, such as the UN University Center for Policy Research, actually adds significantly to what is needed here. And again, expanding the network of who's involved. This is a highly networked initiative, right? It's not one where any particular regulatory mandate, you know, was the key driver. If it becomes that, it becomes a road exercise, and I fear it would lose the passion and the momentum it truly needs. But it's a matter of the heart, right? And we change one life at a time. We're here to serve our communities and make a difference. And it's that attitude, it's that mindset that I think really is the transformative one, rather than being a regulatory dictate. Clearly, the regulators can help with matters of policy and how we can provide better inclusion and services to the survivors and clientele, but that's not what it's about. And if it ever becomes that, I think it risks diminishing this. So social good and our commitment across the globe and societies to do social good is the key driver, as well as that personal passion.
If I may add, Daniel, just one other thing. Certainly for us, using the NGOs, I mean, we've done it both on Project Protect, but also on Project Shadow for the child sexual exploitation on the internet. The role of NGOs is critical for getting that message out as well. I have not met anyone anywhere where, when I talk, or Timea talks about the impact of human trafficking on individuals, that they can stay unaffected, that they don't immediately want to make a difference and see what they can do individually or corporately to address the issue. And I think it's key that that message comes out, that it's not just the regulators, or it's not just the intelligence, or it's not just law enforcement. There are individuals that are impacted daily by this, and people have to hear that. And when they do, I've not met anyone that's not moved by that.
Thank you so much. We do have a microphone in the room. I said maybe to have a first round of questions or comments. Floor will be open. Anyone? Rolf is from. You have to wait for the microphone. Rolf is from Deloitte.
Thank you very much. A quick question to Stuart. I was listening when you said that you were also not putting any special monitoring in place for these accounts. And of course, there's a lot of things that you could consider about it. What were your considerations to say we don't need any special monitoring?
That's a great question. You know, as we thought about we have existing monitoring systems that are designed to catch activity that we would consider reporting to the regulators if deemed suspicious, or we had reasonable grounds to suspect something was going on. But more importantly, you know, we do not want to cause high impact to these individuals and consider their risk profile any significantly different than anyone else, because they truly are trying to recover their financial lives. And they're bringing this level of, you know, we are providing that qualified referral business. And I think because of the qualified referral process, we're able to make this this adjustment in policy. Some banks may choose not to do that, but it's clearly one that we think it reduces the impact to the survivors. Also working with the NGOs, and we've heard of other use cases where the NGOs and or the survivors are getting questions peppered back from the banks about, well, you know, why are you doing this? Or perhaps you made payments back to your former trafficker. These are true issues that these survivors are dealing with, and they're trying to get out of certain situations, and they do find themselves in recidivism sometimes. So, you know, that's the role of the NGO to work with them in that. It's not the role of the bank to, in my opinion, to provide surveillance of that sort.
Thanks a lot. I think Rolf and I are both making notes here. I think, Rolf, I hope you don't mind that I mentioned that we are working to try to convince other banks, not too far away from here, I won't name them now, to join these initiatives. I don't think I have identified a lot of passion yet, and I think that's an important element. It was more legal concerns that came up in the conversation. So I think that's important to turn around. And bringing in survivors. We had Barry and Stuart, we had a public event yesterday where our common friend Timea spoke. And you know, this is changing the conversation we're having. And I think this inclusion of survivor NGOs representing survivors is key and essential, especially with those that have not joined us in that group of committed partners. So thank you very much for sharing this with us. If you can stay with us, wonderful. If you need coffee and have to run to other meetings, I already say now that it was really a pleasure seeing you again. We're very much looking forward to continuing our joint work. And now we're moving on to Teresa Forbes. Teresa, I mentioned we know each other for a while, and you have been instrumental not only in helping us to get up and running, but also in all the US efforts. You're spearheading US Treasury's work on on trafficking in persons. I think that's a technical term you're using in the US. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from you also on, maybe what your plans are or what the community, the international community's plans are in that regard. Teresa, all yours.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. And it's been amazing and incredible just to watch the FAST initiative kind of grow. And I'm really proud of where it is now, particularly how it does put the survivor's voice first. And I think that's something that should continue. That's something as we talk about within our own public-private partnerships within the US or within the multilateral space, it really is having that survivor focus. And I think that's really important. So I was really glad that that is still continuing within this. In particular as well, starting all of these efforts at the Department of Treasury, I really took it from the anti-money laundering perspective, really using financial tools to go after human traffickers and using those tools to kind of shape that way, but then pivoting a little, not just to focus on using financial tools to go after human traffickers, but to use financial tools to help support victims and survivors and vulnerable populations. And so I think that's really important, that survivor inclusion initiative work that you all are doing. And we've actually demonstrated it as a model within our yearly State Department issued trafficking in persons reports. We have a whole call out section on the role of the financial sector, and we call out the FAST initiative and how important that is in the survivor inclusion initiative and the work that you all are doing. So I really commend that. I think that's really important. One of the things that I heard yesterday and I hear a lot in this space is, human trafficking is a financial driven crime, but when it comes to actually getting restitution back to survivors, we're really failing as a global community. It was mentioned in yesterday, I had the pleasure of being able to attend some of the panels throughout this event. And one thing that was mentioned was that when survivors are even getting restitution, most of the time that doesn't happen. And I think that's something to pause and think about is why are we not using our collective energies to try to push for that more on the restitution side. And I think that might be an area that the Fashion Initiative within the UN system can try to work with the UNODC as they're trying to build out capacity building of authorities and looking at human trafficking as a predicate offense, money laundering and illicit proceeds, to use that what we call follow the money approach to try to get at those proceeds. You can get them back to the survivor for restitution. So I can see the FAST kind of pushing within the UN system, not just what was mentioned earlier, like in other areas of overlap with climate initiatives, but also on the capacity building side and the work that the UNODC does. We think it's really important that we try to get restitution for survivors. One of the other things in this kind of vein as well is the work of the financial intelligence units. And I had the benefit of leading the first project within the Egmont group on trafficking in persons and human trafficking. I think there's a need to continue more work and information sharing within the financial intelligence units. And maybe that's another area too that the FAST can work with UNODC to help build capacity with FIUs to do more in this space. I know Canada was a part of that as well as other countries, and we got a lot out of that information sharing. Now that it's been a couple of years, we've been able to develop, the financial institutions have been reporting more information. So there may be an area to work within the Egmont to be able to share more information to take a collective action. It's human trafficking, modern day slavery. It's an event that doesn't happen just within one country's border. So it's really important that we continue these multilateral efforts. Another area is utilizing human rights sanctions regimes. I think will be really important as well. Now that countries have started to develop that haven't had them, we have new human rights sanctions regimes that are coming out and really trying to multilateralize our sanctions efforts. That's another area that we as a global community can work together. And lastly, on the government side as well is understanding our risks when it comes to human trafficking and modern day slavery. We in the United States issued within our national money laundering risk assessment a couple years ago, identifying that human trafficking was one of the highest risks of money laundering within the United States, which then led to recently this year, FinCEN as a financial intelligence unit and one of the many regulators we have in the United States, identifying human trafficking as an anti-money laundering priority to really help demonstrate and show again to the financial industry that this is something that they should be taking notice of. So those are my first thoughts, and I'll pivot really quickly as well to some of the other things that we've been seeing in particular. I'm really happy to see within this conference, there's been a lot of discussion on forced labor and what we can do. I think that's really ahead of where the global community is though. When I started these efforts within Treasury, there was a high focus on addressing human trafficking, but only addressing sex trafficking. I think it's really important as well to keep the focus in addition to sex trafficking also on forced labor and labor trafficking and supply chains. And breaking down those silos within our own government regimes, but also within financial institutions to really address forced labor holistically from an ESG perspective. But it's not only that, there are due diligence requirements that financial institutions and industry has when it comes to forced labor. It was mentioned earlier within trade and import restrictions, anti-money laundering, given that forced labor is a predicate offense, and then sanctions as well as countries are utilizing their sanctions regimes. I think that's an area that the FAST can look towards in the future is what can we do to maybe help financial institutions understand due diligence from not only a money laundering perspective, but this broader perspective that can help break down the silos within a financial institution and looking at supply chains and forced labor a little bit more closely. And we've seen that the incredible role that financial institutions play, not only because they have regulatory requirements within the AML space, but also when they are doing these additional things outside of what their regulatory requirements are, as we've heard a lot of, helping them kind of expand and see what they can do further within their own customer due diligence programs and transaction monitoring, but then working within and looking at their supply chains from a broad perspective. Some of the other things that have been mentioned earlier that I'll just reiterate, it's really important as the work is being looked at, is to also consider those vulnerable populations and how to help them as well. I think prevention of human trafficking and forced labor in development projects and in finance is really important. Expanding the role of the different products and services that in the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, there's a lot of discussion on that, and we've talked about it, and I'm really excited to see the fast move in the regional direction and expanding that Survivor Inclusion Initiative. I think one of the things to think about is how can we expand the current initiative within the different products and services that are offered. And as I asked the question yesterday, but it's not just about access, because survivors of human trafficking have access to remittance services. They're able to walk into a Western Union in many cases and utilize that. But sometimes it's not just about access, it's about equity. And there are barriers for use of those types of services, particularly with costs and fees and things. So how can we also promote not only access, but equity for survivors in the Survivor Inclusion Initiative? A couple of other areas, I think, and this was talked about, and I was really excited on one of the panels yesterday, a really robust conversation on the overlap of human trafficking and forced labor in these environmental crimes or crimes against nature. I think there's different terms that we've used, but that's another area that not only the G7 has committed to taking up, but also the G20 in looking at those areas and the illicit proceeds of it. But also I think it's really important to look at that overlap as well within the illegal mining sector, illegal logging, IUU fishing as well. There's a lot of forced labor there. And so I think that's another area to really expand and look at how can we shape the direction, future of things when we're talking about it's not happening in silos. And so there is a lot of ongoing work. The Financial Action Task Force just released their report on environmental crimes and money laundering. And one thing is I was working on that to really make sure and highlight some of the connections with human rights and corruption as well, in particular human trafficking. So I think that's another area to look at and expand in. And also other overlaps with other types of predicate offenses that we're looking at, as mentioned earlier, transnational organized crime, corruption. There's been a lot. I think that's been within the US, it's definitely a priority national security issue and concern. And so how can we address these issues, not just in silo, but the overlap between corruption, in particular forced labor with bribes that are being paid to customs officials, for example. I think within the US, we've are gathering with public information. There's a gathering with the Summit for Democracy later this year virtually in December, which will coincide with International Human Rights and Corruption Days on December 9th and 10th, hopefully an in-person summit following a year after, where countries as well as the private sector will be making commitments in 3 different areas. One of them is in human rights and promoting human rights. So is there an area or a way we can use and capitalize on that Summit for Democracy to push not only countries to address this issue further, but also the private sector within the private sector call to action? One of the other areas, and I was really excited to hear within the environmental crime space, the work that's going to be going on in the analysis within Ghana. I think that's really important work. There might be an opportunity to look at forced labor from a different sector analysis approaches, because we know forced labor happens in so many different sectors talked about during this event. Some of the environment, and it was mentioned as well within the cotton, the fashion industry, there's the agricultural side of it. So maybe there could be potential work that can be done on sector analysis that can help shape policy decisions that countries are making, as well as the financial sector, and helping them understand their risks within their own supply chains. And then lastly, this was mentioned earlier as well, just looking at opportunities within other regions and jurisdictions to expand this work and to promote more of this. These are things that we're all talking about here. We have a large presence from Europe and North America, but how can we expand into the the whole entire globe, bringing more in with Asia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, where human trafficking is happening, forced labor in particular, more within the Africa continent, and expanding some of this work within the regional presence as well. I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I'm really proud of what the FAST has been able to accomplish and in such a short amount of time. And it really does show that when you do have all those passionate people in the room together, there's a lot of work that we can get done. I'm really excited to be a part of this and to be a part of the future of where this is going, and to be able to utilize within my role any opportunities that we can take to help support these efforts, help promote them, and help expand into the future of where the FAST is going. I know we've talked, Daniel, a lot too on the side of financial due diligence and what we can do there in bringing together the financial sector, not just from the anti-money laundering perspective, but kind of that whole approach. That's something we're trying to do within the US. We have a public-private partnership event on human rights abuse and corruption every year, where we bring together the private sector as well as civil society. And I've always had human trafficking on the agenda. This year it will be from the perspective of supply chains and forced labor. Last year we had a very robust conversation on the use of digital identity, which I think is another area that the FAST can really capitalize on. The Financial Action Task Force has done a lot of work already in helping promote the use of digital identity. We've heard so much about how survivors, because they don't have the identity documents for various reasons, maybe from a migrant situation and leaving a situation like that, or that their trafficker has held on to their documents. So many reasons for it, but the use of digital ID can be a tool as well to look towards in the future to help survivors not only have access to the financial system, but access to other services that they're in critical need for to help make them whole again. So that was something we've talked about before within our partnership event, but I think that's another area of opportunity to expand and grow in. And I'm looking forward to working with you all as well in the here on this panel, in the room with the FAST initiative on all of these different areas and where the FAST is going. I'm really looking forward to that and excited to see where we will be, kind of having a look back again and a future looking in the future and seeing what we'll be able to accomplish as a global community. So thank you again for having me here.
Thanks so much, Teresa. I'm already looking forward to our next meeting or call. We had you in New York recently, and it's great following up. We certainly heard your call for cohesive approaches, collaboration, equity, particularly important in that context, but also your offer, of course, to continue to support us is very well taken. You also mentioned information exchange and the importance of information exchange, like many before. Haney yesterday starting, many others have brought that up. And we wanted to finish this panel and outlook, not with a problem, but with a possible solution. And we have been referred to Ronan Cohen from Duality Technologies by a government, because that's what you're working with. You're providing solutions also to the public sector. And it's a good example how technology can contribute to achieving our goals. So Ronan, we're running a little bit out of time, so I must ask you to be as short as possible, but I'm sure your presentation will be very well received. Please, all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning to all, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. As Daniel said, my name is Ronan. I lead product strategy for Duality Technologies. We are a privacy technology company that enables organizations to collaborate with one another in a privacy protected, secure, and regulatory compliant manner. My background is perhaps a bit different than my co-panelists. I've spent my career on the financial technology side of things. So hopefully I can lend a little bit of a different perspective and share a bit more with you about an innovative category of technology called privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs for short. I'll try to give you a brief overview of what these technologies are and what they're used for. and discuss how they can be leveraged in the fight against human trafficking and other human crimes. So to begin, I think it would be helpful to illuminate the challenge that pets help solve. And that is the problem of collaborating on and leveraging sensitive data. In order to extract insights from data, it must be analyzed, enriched, potentially even joined with other data sets. However, regulatory, privacy, security, and often competitive concerns obstruct these efforts. This is particularly true in the case of cross-border or cross-organizational collaboration. To date, these roadblocks have traditionally been quite difficult to overcome, taking many months of legal wrangling and negotiations, or sometimes being all out impossible. And this is a particularly acute challenge in financial services, where a typical financial institution may only see between 10 or 25% of its own customers' financial activity. This is because a consumer like you or like I often have accounts with multiple financial institutions or fintechs. And this leads to a massive blind spot in terms of risk mitigation. And this is a major contributor to the challenges we're all familiar with around fighting against money laundering and terrorist financing, fraud, scams, human crimes, you name it. And this is exactly where PETs, privacy-enhancing technologies, promise to help. These are technological tools and methods by which one can share information while still ensuring that privacy and security are preserved. There are many different types of PETs. Some that you may have heard of are called multi-party computation or differential privacy. However, the leading technology is called homomorphic encryption. And despite how difficult it might be to say, homomorphic encryption has quite a simple and compelling value. It enables organizations to jointly analyze encrypted data without revealing sensitive information. And it is this unique capability that enables organizations like financial institutions, law enforcement agencies, and governments to collaborate with one another on deriving insights from sensitive data while still ensuring that that data is protected. We have a long history of working with this technology, dating almost 12 years already, when members of our founding team first implemented it actually for the United States Department of Defense to help protect freedom of speech in countries with repressive governments. Since then, our team has continued working with the US government on areas like COVID-19 response, cybercrime prevention, and more. And we're also working with the private sector to facilitate secure collaborations, particularly in financial services. Here, we've been keenly focused on enabling financial institutions to collaborate with one another on financial crime mitigation, from better KYC to building better detection models, to more effectively investigating financial crimes. For example, in one public project, we actually had the opportunity to work with Scotiabank on an interbank information sharing system wherein multiple financial institutions could collaborate on anti-money laundering investigations in a privacy protected and secure manner. Using this system, organizations could ask each other key questions around account and beneficial ownership, sources of funds, account relationships, transaction patterns, and more, all in a privacy protected manner, and receive results in a matter of minutes rather than days, weeks, or months, which is unfortunately all too typical today and means criminals can continue operating for far too long. The technology that Scotiabank and others have utilized has been validated many times over. For example, we have received a formal 314B association designation from the US Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, meaning that any registered US financial institution can use this technology to collaborate with other institutions on anti-money laundering, counterterror, and other predicate offenses like fraud, cyber crimes, and of course, human crimes. The implications of this technology on the fight against human trafficking and human crimes are far-reaching. At a time of ever more sophisticated, globalized crime, it enables a variety of stakeholders to join forces and leverage collective intelligence. We are right now deploying a new privacy-preserving network focused on sharing information on the victims and perpetrators of crimes in a privacy-preserving manner. By using this system, financial institutions can ask their peers and other stakeholders like law enforcement if a new loan applicant or wire beneficiary or customer has been the victim or perpetrator of crimes such as fraud, identity theft, data breaches, and human trafficking. Privacy must be protected because of the sensitivity of the data and the questions. Existing data privacy and banking regulations, and also due to the simple fact that participants may also be competitors, and you can't overstate that fact in financial services. This system therefore ensures that organizations have comfort with sharing sensitive information, which helps them not only keep bad actors out of the financial system, but let good actors in while reducing risk. It also, of course, prevents insiders from being tipped off during these sensitive investigations. So as you take this opportunity to review what the FAST initiative has accomplished and also to look forward, I urge you to think of ways that you can make sharing sensitive information with one another safer, more secure, and faster, and also give you the ability to include more stakeholders to protect some of the most vulnerable populations on Earth. Because at the end of the day, it is only by working together as a network that you can beat networks, whether they are of fraudsters or money launderers or scammers or the most despicable human traffickers. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my remarks.
Thank you so much, Ro, not only for the work you do, but actually you're helping us bust a few myths around achieving social goals or fighting money laundering. And one of the myths we have discussed earlier is the excuse, if I may say so, that there is no data or it's hard to access. So that's a myth I think that should about to be busted. It's just a question of how much are you willing to invest to get the data. Of course, much can be done, and I will speak about that a little bit later to improve that. The second bust is legal concerns that we hold all the time, and we all know, and I'm a lawyer myself, if there is really a legal problem, why don't you change the law? Then you have removed the legal problem. So there is no legal problem that cannot be resolved. The third myth is privacy concerns, and I think here again technology can help addressing privacy concerns. So I think that's helpful. Penny, I saw your hand up, please. You need the microphone.
Thank you. And indeed, it's extremely important and interesting to know more about these privacy enhanced techniques, and we know about them. There's just one warning I would want to give. In the Netherlands, we indeed believed that these techniques would allow the banks to start cooperating more, specifically on the themes that Rowan was just pointing out. But so far, our privacy authority still believes that although these are the privacy enhanced techniques, this is still not allowed. So we are still trying to overcome that. And for that reason, we have now pushed forward that we need a legal change to allow indeed the banks with using these pets, because we have them in place, to indeed start working, because we're there, we're willing, we can. But there is still our privacy authority, our legislative council still has come to the conclusion that it is not allowed. So here there is still a barrier that is not necessarily being overcome with a pet. So I'm very glad that in the US, obviously it's possible, but I also want to send the warning sign that's not everywhere the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. Yes, agreeing that the right to privacy is also a human right, so we should not take this lightly, these concerns. But my impression is there's a little bit of disconnect between our colleagues from the data protection side and the real issue. I mean, I've been on a journey on that, and I've changed my view also on that point fundamentally. And it was the work here we do, people like me and others, that I think we have to show what the reality is and what the impact is of these barriers. And that may also lead to a change of view. But then the more straightforward way is actually, because colleagues in data protection also work on a legal basis, is to review the legal basis and maybe reflecting on was that really the intention originally. But yes, it is, we can't be naive. This is a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard. Maybe something also for us to contribute. Excellent. So I would love to hear more questions. However, we are already lagging behind a little bit. So unless there is a urgent, if you have an important contribution to make, or a question also to ask to our panelists, then there is room for that, but we have to be mindful of time. Good, thank you very much. So let us first thank all panelists of this panel before we move on to the closing sections with a very warm round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we move directly to the last part, which is called closing remarks. And I believe it's probably more than closing remarks. What I hope is what we could agree upon or join is a call to action. Because that's certainly something we have, most of us knew already. And we have even learned more in the last 1.5 days about the necessity for that call to action. And I'm very pleased that we have Amy Rahe with us remotely, though, but present here through technology. Amy Rahe is a partner of the FAST initiative from early days on. She's with the Freedom Fund, who does tremendously important work to assist survivors of human trafficking. And I think that the word you have chosen for your organization is it's about freedom. Great to have you here, Amy. I know it's early in the morning. I appreciate greatly that you got up for us so early in the morning. And I would like to invite you to give us some thoughts before I would try to come up with a few takeaways. Amy.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I just want to say hello to everyone and extend a lot of gratitude to you and to Liechtenstein for putting on these last few days and to starting this really important initiative. I found it for the conversations that I've joined when I've not been sleeping. I found it really inspiring to hear these conversations and to hear some of the innovations that are being thought about, that are being done. I find it also incredibly inspiring to think about the ways that the financial sector can partner with the anti-slavery sector to think about how finance has and can impact whether and how modern slavery manifests. So I want us to celebrate these innovations, to celebrate the growth, to celebrate the progress towards these goals, and the goals being deeply rooted in the very ambitious goal of eradicating modern slavery by 2030. But I also want to take a moment to root us in some harsh realities. The realities being that our estimates for how many people exist within modern slavery at the moment are quite conservative, and that's a euphemism. We estimate that it's over 40 million people, but those figures are currently about 5 years old, and they also reflect a world that was not ridden with a global pandemic, a pandemic that saw migrant workers displaced, families increasingly desperate, and children losing parents or caretakers at a horrific rate. Also, the reality that we're seeing governments overturned, conflict rising in areas where we were starting to gain momentum in eradicating modern slavery, the reality that climate crises will continue to increase. And all of these points will create even more unsafe migration. So while we are making headway with more awareness, with new innovative tools, with innovations like blockchain and tech that we've even heard about here, creating access for survivors in the financial system. I know that we're going to soon be hit with the biggest reality check once the Global Slavery Index is published next year. The reality that modern slavery has actually increased significantly, and that most of our efforts have been dealt a huge blow. We also need to ground in the fact that funding for most of these innovations has stagnated, if not decreased, which makes it harder. Now, as a self-identifying pessimistic optimist, I don't say these things to stop us in our tracks or to make us believe that there's nothing that can be done. Quite the opposite. I'm saying these things to encourage us as change makers, as hard workers in this room, to dream bigger, to fight harder, and to accept and understand one another with more love. And no, this is not a sermon, American as I am, but we have to think about these things in order to transform ourselves, our communities, our governments, our policies, and our systems. And it is only through the change of all of those parts of both the micro and the macro that we will actually start to see the change in vulnerabilities that allow modern slavery to persist. One of the things I've enjoyed about listening, or I've enjoyed about the last few days and that I've enjoyed listening to, is hearing how both of these approaches, the bottom up, the micro, the bottom up and the top down, how both of these approaches are being addressed in the FAST initiative. So I would talk about the Survivor Inclusion Initiative being something that's bottom up, right? Really thinking about, how do we support survivors? How do we support those who are most impacted into having one less barrier to freedom? And through that very micro, that attempt at impacting one person's life, you actually start to change a whole lot more. Because what you do is now create awareness amongst those bankers. You change the financial institution through rethinking the barriers that were there for very good reasons, not wanting to support criminal activity and all of the rest of it, but realizing actually some of the people that we're leaving out are those who are vulnerable. So how do we create space for that? When we think about the top down, think about the supply chain transparency and thinking about how we start to confront the systems that have allowed our supply chains to be where they are. And partly it's been that way for ages, for centuries. We've allowed so many of our products, so much of what we consume to come from slave labor. So these top-down and bottom-up approaches must exist together in order to actually see that change happen. So my ask, my call to action to everyone here today is not around specific policies or around some of these parts of this initiative. But my ask is that we continue to think about the micro, ourselves and our communities, through thinking about the clothes we wear, the food we eat, our computers and our phones that we're all using right now. Who's made it possible for these materials to make their way to us? Continue to question these components in our lives. And then also, I want to challenge us to think about the macro, the systems, the policies, and the governments that have made modern slavery status quo. The acceptance of poverty in certain countries or regions, the acceptance of misogyny, of racism, and the systems that make it okay to purchase equipment from an area of genocide and severe exploitation. Now I'm asking that we go further and not just think, but dream about how we can continue to create change how we can continue to create innovative solutions that incorporate both the bottom up and top down approaches to actually see this change that we're talking about, that we're driving for. So I started this by rooting us in some tough realities. And I want to end with hope in this call to action, in this call to continue to dream. And to me, the hope is that we're all here. We're all here talking about this, dreaming about solutions, because we know that this is a horrific crime and we all want to see it end, and we're finding ways to make that possible. The hope that solutions continue to be dreamed up and acted upon here and elsewhere. And the hope that in the knowledge that sometimes we have to break down in order to break through. And right now we're seeing a breakdown of systems and community structures. And my hope is that this will create the path to a breakthrough of a more equitable and just future where modern slavery does not exist. And I believe the people in this room and this initiative can support creating that pathway. So thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you being here.
Amy, I'm not sure if you're able to hear the very warm applause that your words have triggered. I can't think of better arguments for this call of action than the ones you have mentioned here. Before I will round up with a few thoughts on what we believe we can take away from the 2 days, can I ask Christian Veneweser just to say a few words? You need the microphone. Christian, you were one of, or the spiritus rector of the FAST initiative. So curious to hear what you think about what we have heard in the last 2 days.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. There's so many takeaways, and I very much look forward to processing that with you and your team and with people in the room. I wanted to just to thank everybody really for coming. It's terrific to have you back here in Liechtenstein. I want to thank you and your team, Daniel, and of course my own team and the Foreign Office for these extremely productive discussions. In the big ticket items that we will be dealing with, I think, for me, what we need to work on is creating leadership for this. We have, I think, a very good number of terrific initiatives, and FAST, of course, for us is the key terrific initiative. But I don't think we have been able yet to create the momentum at the political level for this that is required to tackle this. I'm at the UN. At the UN, human trafficking, we didn't invent the topic. Human trafficking has been on the agenda for a very long time, and to be quite frank, it's a relatively stale conversation at the UN. The resolution on human trafficking is run by Belarus at the UN, which is engaged in weaponizing migration, and the conversations have been very focused on a sole law enforcement angle that we all know and think is insufficient. So this is not to downplay the role of the UN. We think the UN is a terrific place to shift the narrative. And I of course very strongly believe in passion. I very strongly believe in personal leadership, but I think the narratives of market failure, the narratives of economic cost along the lines of what Timea has said yesterday, the narratives of risk of forced labor, the way Dame Sarah has talked about it today, will be key in moving this forward, both with governments and with financial institutions, and we need to continue doing both. There is, and again, Dame Sarah has said it a couple of times, of course there's no competition between the E and the S. But there is not only no competition, but the 2030 agenda actually says you cannot achieve one without the other. And so they're really truly complementary, and it comes together certainly in fast. So, you know, we'll talk much more, you and I, in New York, and many of us in the room. I really want to thank everybody. For us, it's wonderful to see that, you know, we have a guaranteed continued lifespan of FAST, and I really want to thank the donors, in particular, of course, NORAD, for making this possible, and we will certainly continue to be engaged very strongly politically and also financially in this. So thanks everybody for being in Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Christian. I have 7 thoughts, and some of them relating also to points you brought up, and the prelude. The prelude is, we always speak when we introduce FAST of a multi-stakeholder initiative. I hope, and I guess the last 1.5 days have shown what we mean by that. It's fantastic that so many of you have contributed to that. And it was a deliberate choice of us when we planned the conference to actually mostly let speak others, and we would not so much talk what we are doing. There's much more we could have said what we are doing, but we wanted to give a floor and an audience and a podium to our partners, and I'm so grateful that they have responded to that invitation. 7 thoughts. One is what you said, it's the holistic view. You know, there's one cohesion is slavery and trafficking within the S in ESG, and then there is cohesion between the E and the S and the G. And I like what Christian said, it's maybe the G first, maybe it's the S first. Actually, it doesn't matter what comes first. There's no ranking between the 3. How can we, you know, live in a parent where, and climate collapses, how can we live on a planet where we have no social cohesion and where we have the relevant governance model? And I think that was the idea behind it. The second thought is I always knew we have a big asset here in the FAST initiative, but I was so much reconfirmed that this is a huge asset, is our cooperation with our partners. This is what we mean by leverage also. I think I'm inspired to think even more creatively about leverage. There's so many there's so many financial institutions in the world, we cannot cover all, but what we heard about insurance, for example, is really an area that I think has a huge potential. Also the work we do with walk-free on stock exchanges probably has leverage that we haven't even fully thought about yet. So that's something we certainly want to take forward. Many of you have referred to the transformative nature of financial inclusion. Has been reconfirmed, very motivating for us to work forward, especially in the Global South, where, you know, work on investors, that's an unfortunate, inconvenient truth, but capital is still in the Global North, so we have to work in the Global North on moving investment. But financial inclusion is predominantly a topic in the Global South, and we want to be a truly global program. So that has been reconfirmed. We will increase, I think, our work and our resources on financial inclusion, also because it's a preventative issue, complementing the predominantly repressive approach taken so far. We had a good discussion, and we will have more on showing risks and the availability of data. Again, I think I don't say anyone is using that as an excuse that is here, but people do use it as an excuse of not engaging. This is around. Not here, nobody here said it, but it is there. And Ralph, I think, I'm citing you, although you mentioned it, the data is available, it's just the question is how much are you going to invest in actually getting it. However, I think we can do more on creating cohesive material, making it more transparent of what is around, so also to bust this myth that the data is not available. Of course you can see slavery and trafficking if you want. And I think we have to help the financial industry, not those present here, but more outside, to actually realize that. Now, there's a lot of advantages of the FAST project being housed in a UN system. There's probably a limitation to what we can do in creating data. You know, we probably can't host naming and shaming lists. That's not the role the UN would be very good at. Probably limitations, but I think we can show what others are doing in that regard. So maybe a map of mapping, a map of maps of what is available. One example was an excellent one that Louis presented. That was the reason we brought him in, to actually show that there is data. But showing more comprehensively and broadly of what is actually around is certainly something we will consider doing. And then I think other sort of more comprehensive, recurring, overarching issues that came up with around transparency and disclosure in particular. Sarah, you brought it, many others too. Switching on the light, we learned that in money laundering, that if you deal with figures in the dark, you occasionally have to switch on the light. And that in itself will have, will allow people to engage and civil society to come in and support what we are doing. So I think we can increase, bring in even more light to that. Certainly a role that I would see for our program. And then, you know, last but certainly not least, passion, survivor inclusion, making this relevant for the audience. This is not just a call like many others, and you should do this and you should do that. There is no alternative to ending modern slavery and human trafficking by 2030. I've been asked by people, like, it's a pretty unrealistic goal. It is not an unrealistic goal. Or the question back would be, if you think it's unrealistic, what is your goal? How many slaves would you be happy to accept by 2030? 10 million? 5? I mean, there is no alternative. And I think when you look at what happened in the last 12 months about bringing vaccination to 1 billion people, don't tell me it's impossible to end modern slavery. This has been a huge effort. There was political will on the public side, political will on the private side, and it was possible. This has cost much more efforts. So I think my conclusion is certainly there is a way forward. It's a multi-stakeholder problem. It's a multi-stakeholder response we need. But yes, we can certainly bring modern slavery and trafficking to an end by 2025. That's the first goal, and then 2030. Definitely we can. So with that, let me just also, like Christian, thank a few people, particularly for making this conference possible, but also for continuing to work with us on the follow-up. For us at FAST, that's the beginning now of a new phase. We are concluding basically FAST 1.0, technically at the end of the month for our donors that have funded FAST 1.0, but we're already in FAST 2. So, well, I want to thank first, well, all of you. You know, we have nearly 30 people here speaking, either on the podium or in breaks or joining us remotely. Great thanks for you all. We all have very busy agendas. It's really a privilege for us to have had you here in that conference. Thanks a lot. All the other people joining us here, then in particular our colleagues and friends in Liechtenstein, that has been a lot of efforts behind the scenes, a lot of calls we had, and emails exchanged. I can't count them. So thanks for all that support. It went extremely smoothly. Thanks to our technicians here. You know, I was a little bit concerned, being given my age. I'm not so handy with new technology. Everything worked very smoothly. Thanks a lot for that support too. I also want to thank James Cocaine, that many of us know, the other spiritus rector of the FAST initiative, and you know, one of the founders. He couldn't be here with us, given that there's still very rigid travel restrictions from Australia, but I think he owns a lot of credit for what we have achieved. That has been, without him, we wouldn't be where we are now. So I'm not sure if you can hear us, James, if you are somewhere out there, but certainly pass on that to you. You know, you have done tremendous work to make this happen, and we are happy to continue the good work you have been starting. And then, of course, last but not least, my team here, Simon and Janina here, but also Andy, Leona, Tosita, and Jacob, and in particular Anthony. I do hope you hear us. You have all been in touch, I think, with Anthony over the last time. Anthony is our Chief Communication Officer, but without him, we wouldn't have had that event. So thanks a lot for all that support. I wish you all a safe journey. For those of you, some of you have a long journey, some of you have a shorter. I wish you all a safe journey. I do very much looking forward to staying in touch with you. We have a lot of bilateral follow-up. Let me just, the last two housekeeping points is we have a light lunch, so please enjoy that. There's still some food and continue the discussions you have started. The bus to the airport, for all those that are on the bus is about to leave at 1:30. Please be on the bus, because the bus can't leave if people that have registered for the bus are not on the bus. However, the bus must leave at some stage in order to make your flight. So if you have registered for the bus and have changed your plan, please let us know. And the bus is here at 1:30, and it will leave shortly after as soon as everyone is on board. So again, with that, many thanks all of you. Safe travels. Bye-bye.